Greetings, Zimbabwe, Africa, and the world. Welcome to In Conversation with Trevor, brought to you by Titan Law. I go beyond the headlines and the sensational. Today, I'm in conversation with United States Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols. Ambassador Brian Nichols, welcome to In Conversation with Trevor.
I'm very happy to be with you, Trevor.
Good to have you here. So let's get right to it. You go through your confirmation hearings. You have read all about Zimbabwe. You get your confirmation you've been appointed. You're on the plane flying to Zimbabwe. What's going through your head?
Will SAA let me take my carry-on on board? That was the first thing going through my head.
Right.
They seem to have an issue about weight. But the next thing going through my head was, this is an incredibly exciting time in Zimbabwe. It's 2 weeks before the elections. I've been told that I'm going to be able to present my credentials to the president very quickly, which in fact was the case. This is an exciting moment in a country that really holds the imagination of so many people around the world.
Imagination of so many people around the world. What was the imagination of this country? What were your expectations?
Well, I think it's a country that, anytime your country has a Bob Marley song about it, it's captured people's imaginations. A number of senior policymakers in my country and around the world had done their theses and dissertations on Zimbabwe. It's a country that was a great focus in terms of U.S. and international policy. The chair of my confirmation hearing was Senator Jeff Flake, who lived here, done his master's thesis on Robert Mugabe. So that focus and the moment that I was entering into, one where this is a crucial election, up until that point had been generally free of violence and intimidation, and things seem to be going relatively well. And this could be a moment where there's a real springboard for Zimbabwe becoming a much more democratic, prosperous, transparent country.
So you then land, you present your credentials on the 19th of July. The elections are on the 30th. Has that imagination, the country that you imagine, the hope that you had for this country, have you been disappointed or what?
Well, I've been incredibly impressed with the people of Zimbabwe. This is a country with incredibly talented people, very well educated, very hardworking. When you look at the Zimbabwean diaspora, they're successful all around the world. And that should be the case here. In the wake of the election, on August 1st, I was in President Mnangagwa's office with Senator Flake at that moment, and we were congratulating him on the progress in the elections. And while there were certainly some flaws in the process overall, I thought it was a vast improvement over prior votes. And then later that day, I'm in my office. Gunfire is going on in the CBD. International election observers, we had to send armored vehicles in to get them out, brought them to our embassy, which is on the edge of the CBD at that time. And we're wondering what's gone wrong. What does this mean? What does this portend? The process that Zimbabwe went through with the creation of the Motlanthe Commission, the fact that those recommendations have not been implemented even more than a year after the August 1 violence, the crackdown by security forces even after August 1, I'm talking August 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, you had people going into the high-density suburbs, security forces, and beating people up. It was quite shocking. We wanted to give this government space to address those issues, space to implement the agenda that President Mnangagwa campaigned on. And as we heard at the State of the Nation address, not too long ago, much of that agenda still has not been passed. Many of the reforms that this government campaigned on, alignment with the Constitution of 2013, repeal of repressive legislation like POSA, like IEPA, that has not happened.
Well, why do you think that's all not happened?
I think there are entrenched interests that are resisting reform here, and it's reform isn't easy, but it's important. And when you see the trajectory the country's on now, where inflation is in the hundreds of percent. We measure a basket of 16 basic items in our embassy, mealy meal, bread, cooking oil, basic vegetables, gasoline, or petrol as you call it. That's up 641% year on year as of mid-September. So the things that most people need are incredibly expensive. We've seen very disturbing incidents of abductions of civil society members. We've seen the protests in January and the violence that followed, including turning off the internet. Those things were deeply concerning to the international community and to average Zimbabweans. That a recalcitrance to take on real reforms that could move this country forward is what's holding it back. And you look where Zimbabwe is today, where it was a year ago, where it was 5 years ago. There needs to be concrete, permanent, irreversible reforms to address the challenges that this country faces.
So clearly, from what you're saying, the political reforms are not happening. The economic reforms are not as happening as fast as you would want. Tell me, in a nutshell, as far as the political reforms are concerned, what are the three critical aspects of those political reforms that you want to see come through?
Well, number one, the low-hanging fruit, implement the electoral reforms called upon by 5 different international as well as the domestic election observers across multiple elections. That's something that almost all of these observer reports agree on. The government had said previously that it plans to do so. They've had retreats, they've had discussions. You've had all sorts of people come back from these international missions to participate. They've got a nice grid. All the blocks are filled in. There's no reason why that can't go forward. Second one would be media reform. I think that the media space in Zimbabwe is very narrow. And I congratulate you for maintaining one of the few independent voices here. But it should be broader. This is a country with only one television station. I mean, that's even a small town in most countries has more than one television station. And having an independent voice in television, in radio, there have not been any licensing of new radio stations, either community or national.
So the media reforms have not happened to your satisfaction. You said 3 issues. Which is the third issue as far as political reforms are concerned?
Well, I might have to do more than 3, but I think security force reform is a crucial issue. One of the deep concerns that I think the people of Zimbabwe have and the international community has is that the security forces continue to resort to excessive force in dealing with protests. You've got over 50 abductions that haven't been investigated. You have the violence surrounding protests, as I mentioned, in August, in January, and then in August again. That's something that's crucial. The overarching issue that I think is very important is a broad, inclusive national dialogue to address the concerns that Zimbabweans have. And I think the ZCC's call for such a dialogue is very important. It's something that has the potential to overcome all of these issues, bring people together to face the country's problems in a united way.
I've been thinking about the dialogue issue. And wondering, is there a creative way, instead of calling for dialogue, is there a creative way that the diplomatic community, that our international friends could come up with that lowers the temperature, facilitates an engagement of the parties that are currently fighting? Can we do that? Is that possible?
I think the international community can play an important role in that regard. I think it needs to be, number one, something that fertile ground exists in Zimbabwe to do. I think any international actor is going to want to see some level of positive will from the key parties and stakeholders in Zimbabwe. I also think that this needs to be an African-led solution, and ideally Southern African countries playing a major role in that. SADC in the past has played an important role in mediating disputes. South Africa has lent former President Motlanthe here for the commission that investigated the August 1 violence. So those are players that are vital in that. I think once you go further afield than that, it becomes somewhat more complicated. Obviously, the African Union plays an important role throughout the continent and could be supportive in this area as well.
You know, I'm asking that question with the Kenyan situation in mind, where the late Kofi Annan, with the help of the international community, did make something there happen. Because the problem is we have entrenched interests, entrenched positions on both sides. We need somebody who's going to move both sides to the center and with something that's creative. That's why I asked this question.
Well, in the wake of the elections, we had Kofi Annan as a member of the elders here in Harare, meeting with people, getting to play a role along with Mary Robinson at that time and Lakhdar Brahimi. And we've subsequently had former President Robinson and Graça Machel, former Minister Graça Machel, here to follow up with the elders, and I think that's an important initiative and could yield positive results. Sadly, as we all know, that the former Secretary General took ill and passed on shortly after his visit here. And you think about the role that one man can play in history, and you wonder what could have happened if he'd been able to intensify those efforts a year and a half ago.
Looking at you came in July the 19th, and congratulations on your big building, the embassy. That's beautiful. Is that a sign of the confidence that you have about the future of this country, building that huge, beautiful building?
Let's put the beautiful before the huge.
Right.
But yeah, we spent $292 million building that embassy, and we put a presence here and consolidated our presence. We haven't increased our staff. We went from 6 buildings to 1 building. But that's a measure of the faith that we have that this country can progress, that there is a bright future for Zimbabwe if it reforms, if it takes the steps that I think most Zimbabweans know it needs to move forward. The embassy, in addition to its beautiful architecture on the outside, also has some amazing Zimbabwean artists' works displayed inside. Mafet Takadiwa and Mishek Masamvu are a couple of my favorites, but there are others who've done great works that are in there. And you think this is just another example of the talent of the people of Zimbabwe and how much can be accomplished if they are given the freedom and the support to succeed.
Interesting. This country has been under United States sanctions for the past 17 years. Since the first Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001, which was then amended in 2018. There is an argument that these sanctions are targeted, but as you and I can see what's happening out there, in reality, these sanctions are devastating to the poor person, to the majority of the companies in the country. What's your view about these sanctions, and what's the future like going forward?
Well, I categorically reject that argument. First of all, on Zadara, what Zadara does is it instructs the executive directors of international financial institutions not to vote in favor of new loans or debt forgiveness for Zimbabwe unless a series of conditions are met, broadly economic and democratic reforms, respect for human rights. Those executive directors, the board members, and the World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank have never had a vote on Zimbabwe because this country's own failure to reform has prevented it from ever reaching consideration for debt relief or new lending. So as a practical matter, Zadara has never come into play. In 2003, the executive branch added a Zimbabwe sanctions program, which is a targeted program that currently has 141 persons and entities on it. That's 0.00006% of the population, roughly. That's covered. That does not prevent trade with Zimbabwe. I've brought Fortune 500 companies to Zimbabwe to promote our economic relationship. I've been in meetings with GE Africa and the president. I've hosted the Minister of Health along with Abbott Laboratories at a trade reception in my home. I meet with the American Business Association of Zimbabwe, promote their efforts. CEO Roundtable of Zimbabwe is going to the U.S. for Trade Business Council for International Understanding. I've met with a couple of times in the U.S. to encourage them to do business here. John Deere just had a cabinet-approved sale of $51 million worth of tractors to Zimbabwe. We have several U.S. government-supported investment projects, and by U.S. government-supported, they have the U.S. Department of Commerce has approved formal advocacy for these companies, and they're working on projects. We're in the early stages of development right now. So we are working hard to encourage business and two-way trade between our countries for the benefit of both our peoples. When you look at what is the cause of the economic problems in Zimbabwe, number one, corruption. Corruption has cost this country billions and billions of dollars. The low estimates is over $1 billion a year. Just the recent Auditor General report on Command Agriculture, there's nearly $3 billion unaccounted for in the audited period, which is 2017 and 2018. Just in June to August of this year, you had payouts to Secunda Holdings for Command Agriculture and other purposes at a preferential rate, which increased the money supply in Zimbabwe by 50%. You wonder why the exchange rate collapsed and inflation spiked between June and August of this year? It's that type of operations of illicitly giving people insider sweetheart deals to the detriment of the people of Zimbabwe. Look at today's paper, the story on Zanara and its former head involved in illicit activities as part of a larger scandal, which some have pegged at as much as $71 million. Zesa, they've bought transformers and other equipment that's never been delivered. You have international businesses coming here, putting in bids, winning the bids, being at the verge of signing a contract, and suddenly some insider is parachuted in and they get the contract and then never deliver the products. This happens over and over and over again. You see it every single day. Look at any sector. The procurement of pharmaceuticals in the health sector and all the corruption that goes around that, where people are paying 2 and 3 and 4 times the list price for pharmaceutical products products where, in many cases, free products donated by the international community are available, but no, they're procuring those. Look at the budgets of any ministry here, and you will find that there is tremendous leakage here. Zimbabwe is near the bottom of the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. It's near the bottom of the Ease of Doing Business Index. The World Economic Forum just put out their new numbers, I think, yesterday. The Zimbabwe's at, I think, 127 out of 141 in the World Economic Forum rankings. So these are what the drains are on this country's growth.
And nobody cannot argue against any of the stuff that you've said. But here is the one thing that complicates issues as far as this is concerned. The litany of issues of corruption that you've outlined, they are facts. They are reality that's happened. That's regrettable. But one wonders why America is not even-handed in dealing with Zimbabwe. Let's look at Pakistan. Pakistan gets a lot of support from the Americans and from the IMF. $6 billion to support the IMF staff monitored program. Egypt, with the abuse of human rights, 800 people killed, gets $12 billion for their staff monitored program. Why is there no even-handedness when it comes to these issues? Which raises the issue, is it about human rights or pushing American interests?
Our focus is on the welfare of the people of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has never qualified for the lending associated with an IMF staff monitored program. When they had the last IMF process here in 2016, it turned out that the government of Zimbabwe had been cooking the numbers. And just as that program was ending, you had the introduction of RTGS, you had revelations that there was off-book spending to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that the IMF missed when they were doing their accounting. And certainly that was a shock to the international community. I want to stress that the idea that the United States is not providing support to Zimbabwe is false. The United States is the largest donor bilaterally to Zimbabwe. Since 1980, we've provided over $3.2 billion of assistance to Zimbabwe.
Since 1982?
Beginning with independence.
Okay.
We've provided $3.2 billion in assistance. In 2019, we've provided over $300 million in assistance. For the upcoming lean season, as we refer to it, so that rolling over into 2020 for food security and humanitarian assistance, $86 million in additional funding over our baseline cooperation programs.
My argument is, would Zimbabwe's economy, industry, and commerce be in a position to perform in a manner that brings much more than the Americans are bringing in? Okay. So my point is, the damage that is being inflicted on this economy by the perception and the reality of American sanctions is hurting the country much more than the development assistance that the Americans are giving.
The perception of the issues in Zimbabwe is driven by the actions of the government of Zimbabwe. In the wake, both in the run-up and in the wake of the elections in 2018, I had lots of companies calling and inquiring about investing in Zimbabwe, and there had been no change to our legislation or executive orders at that time. As I mentioned to you, I've brought Fortune 500 companies here to do business in search of deals. The issue is that when people get here and they realize that it's very difficult for them to find an impartial arbiter if they get into a business dispute. If they're trying to set up a business here, one small media investor who wanted to do a sort of a lifestyle media company here, and when the internet was turned off in January, he said, how can I run an internet-based sort of lifestyle magazine here when you can turn the internet off? We've had companies who wanted to work in the manufacturing sector here, and when they see the problems with customs at Byte Bridge, they realize, well, how am I going to deal with this issue? How do I deal with the corruption, with the delays? My truck, if I don't pay a bribe, sits in a queue for 2 days to cross into Zimbabwe, and if somebody greases a palm, their truck goes ahead. You've had stuff stolen out of quote-unquote bonded warehouses under customs control here. The list goes on and on. You look at the Zenara, Zupco, NSSA.
The list does go on and on. I think to round off this issue, the list does run on and on. But if you look at the two countries that have raised, Pakistan and Egypt, the list is even bigger there. And my question was around the even-handedness about dealing with that. But that being the case, the perception about the effect of American sanctions is that we have lost a lot of correspondent banks. From 26 correspondent banks about 12 months ago, we're now down to 6. And the perception and the reality of there being US sanctions is making a lot of banks leave the country because of de-risking, because of the fear that if they do business with Zimbabwean banks, they're going to be punished by the Americans. That's both the reality and the perception of the sanctions hurting the Zimbabwean economy. Ambassador, what do you say to that?
Let's say de-risking is a global phenomenon. Certainly in the post-September 11, 2001 era, the Know Your Customer requirements increased globally. There are many countries that have had to confront de-risking issues, but I think if you want to look at where Zimbabwe can help itself on de-risking, there are a number of reforms that the Financial Intelligence Unit and the Financial Action Task Force within Zimbabwe and globally their partners have called for that need to be implemented to increase transparency in the financial sector. One of the biggest challenges is you see, for example, the loan portfolios with non-performing loans that move for all these non-performing loans into RBZ, the central bank, without real scrutiny of how that was happening, continued leakage in certain banks that have had to be recapitalized. That generates a lack of confidence, I think, in the financial sector above the ambient issue of de-risking and know your customer that many, many countries around the world face, including major countries, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. They've dealt with de-risking issues as well, and the challenge for Zimbabwe as a small market, $26 billion economy, 15 to 16 million people population. If you don't have clear, transparent measures in place, the benefits for the financial sector internationally with engagement don't match the risks. And that's when you have an issue with de-risking. And I think that solution is well within the government of Zimbabwe's ability to address.
Let's move on to an issue now around President Trump's administration and its interest in Africa, the rest of the continent. They've just been legislated the Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development, called BUILD Act. which is in place. Are we going to see more interest and more investment by America in perhaps preferred markets on the continent? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, I think it's absolutely has that potential, and I was smiling as you were saying the full name of the act because I see how clever the people are in finding the right initials and words
very creative.
to fill in. But we think this is a really great initiative that brings a new $60 billion market cap, capitalization because it's not on the market, capitalization of all of our investment and development agencies from the United States government together under one roof, so that we can offer a comprehensive suite of tools for American businesses that are looking for partnerships and relationships around the world.
Any idea of where this is going to be deployed? Which countries, which sectors at the moment?
Well, that's the beauty of our policy, which is it's going to be driven by the market and the private sector. We want to make sure that these initiatives support our overall development goals for our partner countries, but it's going to depend on country X or Y or Z being interested in doing a deal, finding a market, and then we bring them things like market feasibility studies, investment insurance, which is very important, particularly in a country like Zimbabwe where you have Forex risk. That's one of the key things that
so Zimbabwe might be entitled to participate in that?
Oh, I think so, absolutely so. But there's got to be a deal on the table. And, you know, as I've said, I've had Fortune 500 companies come here interested in doing deals. The predecessor agencies of BUILD and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is what the BUILD Act creates, like the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, are already supporting private sector initiatives here in Zimbabwe to do deals that are right now ongoing. So there's no reason why that would change, but it's somebody seeing an opportunity, bringing that to the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, getting the different types of assistance and programming that they have, and then completing that. We believe that this is going to make American businesses more competitive around the world, and Africa is a very attractive market broadly, and Zimbabwe has a number of sectors which I think can be very positive.
Which sectors?
Well, let's start with the ones that can move quickly. Extractive industries. Because of the foreign exchange policies that the government has in place, a lot of people in extractives are leaving the product in the ground. If they can get full value out, they're going to increase production. We already see some new mining initiatives, but I think there could be much more going forward. Tourism. That's one where during the course of a year, we get about 200,000 American visitors to Zimbabwe. There's probably on any given day 8,000 American tourists in country. That sector generally is quite high end. I mean, you have properties here who are charging foreign guests between $500 and $2,000 a night. That's crazy money. And that can grow. And speaking of growing, agriculture. Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It was feeding all of southern Africa a generation ago when there was a drought. It was exporting cut flowers, fruits, vegetables, beef, pork.
So the fact that there's sanctions on Zim is not going to affect this the company's access to this funding. Is that what you're saying?
No, absolutely not.
Let's move on to an issue, a recent issue, a parcel of diamonds coming from Zimbabwe. You know, got, for lack of a better term, confiscated by the authorities, and the reason is that it was mined from forced labor. And there's been denials that there is no forced labor in Marange. What are the real reasons for that parcel of diamonds to have been impounded?
Good news, Trevor. There was no impounding of any parcel of diamonds. What happened is the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has done investigations around the world with one of their areas of competency, which is addressing forced labor in any industry around the world. There was an announcement of withhold release orders on a number of products from different countries around the world, 5 different countries. One of those countries was Zimbabwe, and it's rough cut diamonds from the Marange fields. The issue of forced labor is rather a nuanced one. It's that people enter into relationships with these syndicates that are mining diamonds, and you know Marange well. I mean, all you really need is a shovel and a bucket. It's one of the most incredible diamond fields in the world. But they'll pay a fee or take out a loan to get access to this area, start mining, enter into a relationship. The person who grants them access says, okay, well, in order for you to be here, I'm going to charge you X amount per day or something like that, or to give you some equipment to help you dig for diamonds, I'm going to give you this equipment, but what I'm giving you is worth, I don't know, let's say $200. You owe me $200. And then in that relationship, the person cannot extract themselves from that debt relationship. That's the type of forced labor that Customs and Border Protection is talking about with regard to Marange. As a practical matter, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, since 2016, no Zimbabwean rough-cut diamonds have entered the United States.
Let's move on. France is handing over, or has done so, the presidents of G7 to the Americans. And there was a sense that the French were much more sympathetic to the G7 helping Zimbabwe. But that hope is now fading with the Americans taking over. There's a sense that both the Democrats and the Republicans are united to ensure that the G7 under the American presidents does absolutely nothing to help Zimbabwe. Is that true?
No, what President Trump has said and what the White House has said with regard to our G7 presidency is, one, we want to focus that presidency on specific actions that benefit G7 members and the world, focus on free markets, free trade, and a fair deal for American workers and businesses. We see opportunities to promote those values as well as our other shared values like democracy and human rights. And we want to narrow the number of issues that we are laying out as the G7 chair. We see Africa as an area of promise for the G7, but we want to plant our seeds in fertile ground. So those countries that show that they are interested in free, fair, open markets, countries that are interested in taking on the reforms that they need for international business and trade to flourish, those are the countries that we look to focus on during our G7 presidency.
So let me go back to the sanctions issue and focus you on the fact that the people that are supposed to be targeted by sanctions don't usually get hit by sanctions. The people that get hit by sanctions is the common man on the street. And right now, that common man is suffering. The people that are supposed to be suffering from sanctions are not suffering. The other point is that the sanctions are actually good for a lot of people in ZANU-PF hierarchy that benefit from that. The common man doesn't help. So what I'm putting across to you is that sanctions are actually helping ZANU-PF solidify and hurting the common people. And if the Americans were interested in the human rights and the well-being of Zimbabweans, the sanctions ought to be removed to help the common people and disadvantage those that are in power. What's your response to that?
If the government of Zimbabwe were truly interested in the issue of sanctions and considered this a major problem, rather than having a rally, what the government of Zimbabwe would do was make a chart of what the things that the international community is asking it to do, and then come with an argument saying, we have addressed the concerns that you have here. You, in multiple meetings with my boss, Ambassador Tibor Naj, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, he asked the President Mnangagwa for repeal of POSA and IEPA. Neither of those things have happened. MOPA has been passed, but as far as I know, it hasn't been signed. There has not been action taken to repeal IEPA yet. I know that there's some analysis out there looking at it, but those are concrete things that over a year ago, in September of 2018, my government asked the government of Zimbabwe to do, and these are things that are totally in line with the campaign promises that the president of Zimbabwe ran on. These are changes that are totally in line with the Constitution of 2013, which is a beautiful document and enshrines universal values. The issue, again, of what the effect of international restrictive measures, including sanctions, are on the average person in Zimbabwe, I do not accept the argument that those are having an effect on average people. The 141 persons and entities who are covered do face real restrictions and challenges. If it didn't bother them at all and it made them happier and richer, they would be not having an anti-sanctions day on October 25th. They would be having a thank you for sanctions day on October 25th. So that argument doesn't. They feel bad about it because people are saying you're doing bad things. If you don't want people to say bad things about you, maybe don't do bad things. So, this is an area where the government of Zimbabwe is fully in control of its future. It can take on the reforms that it's already promised to do, implement them, and the hand of friendship remains extended by my government and other Western governments that have similar policies. We want Zimbabwe to succeed. We gave this government a vote of confidence. Look at what we said and did from November 2017 until after the election. We gave this government every benefit of the doubt to carry out reforms. After the violence of August 1, obviously we expressed our concerns, but we gave the Motlanthe Commission time to work. We have met with senior officials in this government repeatedly to talk about our shared concerns, and we've asked them to move forward with the reforms that they promised that they were going to carry out. And that progress has been very slow. The legislative agenda that the president put forward hasn't moved.
Ambassador, would the MDC and ZANU-PF delegation coming to you and saying, we agreed that sanctions must go, would that change anything?
It's not a rhetorical issue. It's not just them coming and saying, okay, we don't need sanctions. We would say, what have you done to promote free, fair, transparent elections? What have you done to address the human rights concerns? What have you done with regard to the SADC Tribunal rulings of 2007 forward with regard to what we might euphemistically call the fast-track land reform program? What have you done with the disappeared people that are specifically cited in the Zadera legislation? Have you taken any steps to address the underlying concerns that we have? That would be our answer.
Let me read to you a sentence from the Economist Intelligence Unit. which says, and I'll tell you why I'm bringing this up, which says we continue to believe that if the military begins to feel the pinch, it could yet oust Mr. Mnangagwa. I asked that question because there is a sense that screws are being tightened and that the people are feeling the pain and that the people will rise up and that with the help of the army, we could have a real coup, a hard coup. Is that an issue that concerns the Americans? Concerns the Americans in such a manner that the Americans say it's something that must be avoided. You are aware of it, and this is what needs to be done for it to be avoided, rather than continuing to ratchet up the pressure. Let's find a way of resolving the crisis that's currently in Zimbabwe. Is that something that occupies you and worries you?
I have no reason to doubt the loyalty of the armed forces of Zimbabwe. Obviously, our national policy and our law opposes coups and military takeovers. So I want to be very clear about that. But in terms of the pressure that is on average people, including members of the security forces, that pressure comes from a lack of political reform. If the government has a choice, and the choice is use the resources it has to pay doctors, teachers, soldiers, police salaries, or use the resources that it has to give Secunda Holdings a preferential exchange rate that no one else gets, and they choose to do that, and then they jump back and say, whoa, what happened? We're going to freeze their accounts, and then 10 days later, they unfreeze those accounts and give them more money. That's a choice that this government is making. That's what causes, I think, the average person here to have these concerns and have this economic pressure. When you see the price of bread go up 1,600% in a year, that is a result of uncontrolled spending and insider dealing. And that in turn leads average soldiers, police, doctors, teachers, lawyers, bus drivers, down the list, to feel this horrible economic pressure where, according to the World Food Program, as many as half the population is food insecure during the lean season 2019-2020. That is a horrible indictment of the agricultural policies of this country and the broader economic path that's going on. And I think that the transitional stabilization program that the government put forward is a very solid economic program, and today is the day that your economic team is in Washington, or at least the day we're filming, not the day we're airing, is in Washington with the IMF and the World Bank and the international community talking about its reform program. And I think the concern that they're going to hear in those conversations is, you have a great plan on paper, you are not implementing your plan fully. Implement the plan that you have on paper.
Ambassador, you are obviously a very busy man. Have you taken time to sample our tourist destinations?
Yes, I have, and they're fabulous.
Which ones have impressed you?
Wow. Well, I suppose the first one I went to, and the one that was incredibly iconic for me, Great Zimbabwe. I love archaeology and history, and visiting Great Zimbabwe and being able to provide an over $400,000 donation for the restoration of Great Zimbabwe was a fabulous trip for me and my wife when we went there.
Which other ones?
Oh, well, I'm just getting started.
Oh, right.
Okay, Victoria Falls is amazing, and it's one of the wonders of the world, and something that I was able to bring my whole family, including wife and daughters, to, and we had a great time there. Wangay broadly is fabulous, and we had a lovely visit there. Mana Pools, spectacular. Been to Bumi Hills, that was also fabulous.
And I saw pictures of you going to Nyanga at some point.
Yeah, well, I didn't make it to Nyanga. I was in Chimanimani.
Oh, because of
for Cyclone Idai relief. I've been in that broad area looking at our landmine removal program through Norwegian People's Aid, which we jointly fund with the government of Norway to do landmine removal in parts of the country. We also fund the Halo Trust in other parts of Zimbabwe. And before I got here, I didn't realize that the Zimbabwe-Mozambique border was the most heavily mined border in the world. And that work is arduous, removing the landmines. And I put on all of the protective equipment. I went out there with the technicians clearing, and we're crawling around and poking sticks. It was incredibly impressive to see their work, their dedication, their professionalism, the fact that they haven't had any injuries to worry about in a very long time.
We thank you for that. We always ask people in this show what books they are reading.
Mm-hmm.
I know you and your family are putting together a whole family tree, which is beautiful. What books are you reading right now?
Well, the last book I finished was 2 weeks in November by Douglas Rogers about Zimbabwe and a certain 2 weeks here. It's a fascinating book. I know that there are other books that have been written and also that are being written and will come out that will provide further depth into that fascinating period in Zimbabwe's history. And I just got Patina Gapa's new book, Out of Darkness, Shining Light. I started reading that about David Livingstone and the end of his life, and the Zimbabweans that worked to repatriate his body and carry him to the coast, and then back to England. And she's such a talented writer. She's also a talented lawyer and a talented public servant. So I'm enjoying that, and I hope if she's listening, she will sign my copy of the book, which I've asked for, and she has not done yet.
I'm also reading the book. It's an amazing book. Ambassador, it's been a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for the conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Right. Thanks for watching. Don't want to miss out on these insightful conversations? Subscribe to our YouTube channel.